They were told America would be their graveyard. The fascist newspapers had filled their heads with stories about American cruelty, about prisoners worked to death in desert camps, about a nation of gangsters who showed no mercy to captured enemies. But when Marco Ricci stepped off the train in a small Texas town in the summer of 1943, sunburned and exhausted from the journey across the Atlantic, a local farmer's wife handed him a glass of cold lemonade and smiled at him like he was a guest rather than a prisoner. He took the glass with trembling hands, tasted the sweet coldness on his tongue, and felt something inside him begin to crack. 2 years later, when the war ended and the American officers announced that Italian prisoners could go home, Marco would stand in that same Texas town and realize he had no desire to leave. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. He had fought for Il Duce, had believed in the promises of glory and empire, had worn his uniform with pride until the day British forces captured him in the North African desert. But here in America, treated with a kindness that made no sense given that he was the enemy, Marco found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the world. If you want to hear more incredible true stories from history that will change how you see the world, hit that subscribe button right now. Let me ask you something. What would make you choose to stay in a foreign country rather than return to your homeland? What kind of treatment could change your entire life direction? The journey to America had been long and strange. First, the British camps in North Africa, then transport to England, finally loaded onto ships bound for the United States. The Italian prisoners had whispered among themselves during the voyage, sharing fears about what waited for them. America was the land of Al Capone and machine guns, or so the propaganda had claimed. It was a country without culture, without history, populated by mongrels who cared only for money and violence. This was what they had been taught to believe, what the fascist regime had drilled into them through newspapers and radio broadcasts, and political officers who spoke with absolute certainty. Marco had been a farmer before the war, working his family's small plot of land in the hills outside Naples. The soil had been poor, the yields modest, but it had been home. He had joined the army because he had no choice, because Mussolini demanded it, because refusing meant shame for his entire family. He had not wanted to fight in Africa, had not cared about empire or glory, had simply wanted to survive and return home to marry the girl who waited for him. Instead, he had ended up in a British prison camp, then on a ship to America, then standing in the Texas heat holding a glass of lemonade that tasted like nothing he had ever experienced. The camp they took him to was not what he expected. There were fences, yes, and guards with rifles, but the barracks were clean and solid, with real beds and mattresses. The mess hall served food that made his eyes widen in disbelief. Meat, real meat, not the scraps and gristle they had eaten in the Italian army. Fresh bread that was still warm, vegetables that had not been boiled into gray mush, coffee that actually tasted like coffee. Marco sat at a long table with other prisoners, all of them eating in stunned silence, their forks moving mechanically from plate to mouth while their minds tried to understand what was happening. The portions were larger than what he had eaten even before the war. Back home when times were normal, the quality was better than what Italian soldiers received, better than what many Italian civilians had seen in years. Marco thought of his mother, his sisters, his neighbors in the village, all of them struggling with rationing and shortages while he, a prisoner of war, ate food that would have been a feast in Naples. The guilt mixed with confusion, and both mixed with a strange, unwelcome gratitude that felt like betrayal. They were put to work almost immediately. The Americans needed labor, especially on the farms and ranches that stretched across Texas and the other states where Italian prisoners were sent. Marco was assigned to a cotton farm owned by a man named Thompson, who picked him and 3 other prisoners up each morning in a dusty truck and drove them out to the fields. Thompson was a quiet man, weathered by sun and hard work, and he treated the Italian prisoners the same way he treated his American hired hands. He showed them what needed to be done, worked alongside them when the job required it, and paid them the small wages that prisoners were allowed to earn. The work was hard, harder than anything Marco had done in the army, but it was honest work that produced something real. Cotton bolls under the hot sun, row after row stretching toward the horizon. His hands blistered, then calloused. His back ached. But at the end of each day, Thompson's wife would have prepared food for all the workers, and they would sit in the shade of the barn and eat together. Fried chicken, cornbread, beans seasoned with pork, sweet tea so cold it made Marco's teeth hurt. Mrs. Thompson would ask them about Italy, about their families, about what crops they grew back home. She asked like she actually cared about the answers. This was the hospitality that would haunt Marco for the rest of his life. Not just the food, though the food was part of it. Not just the fair treatment, though that mattered too. It was the small kindnesses, the human moments that made no sense in the context of war. Mrs. Thompson learning to say buongiorno and beaming with pride when she got the pronunciation right. Thompson teaching them English words for farm equipment, patient with their stumbling attempts. The Thompson daughter, maybe 10 years old, bringing them cookies she had baked herself, shy and sweet, and treating them like uncles rather than enemies. Marco tried to write about this in letters home, but the words would not come. How could he explain to his mother that the enemy treated him better than his own army had? How could he tell his fiancée that he ate meat every day, that he slept in a real bed, that Americans smiled at him and asked about his family? The censors would read anything he wrote anyway, so he kept his letters simple. I am well. The work is hard but fair. I hope you are managing without me. I miss home. These sentences were true but incomplete, leaving out everything that actually mattered. The other prisoners struggled with the same contradictions. At night in the barracks, they would talk in low voices about what they were experiencing. Some, like Antonio from Rome, insisted it was all a trick, that the Americans were being nice only to make them complicit, to use them somehow. Others, like Giuseppe from Sicily, accepted the kindness with a cynicism that expected it to end at any moment. But Marco found himself in a different place, a more dangerous place. He found himself starting to like these people, these Americans, who were supposed to be his enemies. The cultural differences were vast but somehow bridgeable. The Thompsons were Baptists, devout in a way that was different from the Catholicism Marco had grown up with but recognizable in its sincerity. They said grace before meals, thanking God for the food and asking blessings on everyone present, including the Italian prisoners. Marco would bow his head and feel a strange comfort in the ritual, even though the words were in English and the theology was not quite his own. Faith was faith. Gratitude was gratitude. These things transcended nationality. On Sundays, the prisoners were not required to work, and the camp allowed local churches to visit and hold services. A Catholic priest from town came each week to say Mass for the Italian prisoners, and the familiar Latin words in this foreign place brought tears to Marco's eyes. After Mass, the priest would stay and talk with them, bringing news of the war, bringing small comforts like rosaries and holy cards. Father O'Brien was Irish-American, his grandparents immigrants who had fled famine and found new life in Texas. He understood what it meant to be caught between worlds, to love a homeland you had left behind while building a life in America. The priest told them about the Italian-American community in town, immigrants who had come decades earlier and now owned restaurants and shops and had children in American schools. Some of these families would invite prisoners to Sunday dinner, hosting them in homes that smelled of garlic and tomato sauce, and reminded Marco so intensely of his mother's kitchen that he had to excuse himself and stand outside until the ache in his chest subsided. These Italian Americans were prosperous in ways that seemed impossible. They owned their homes, their businesses, their cars. They spoke English with American confidence, but cooked Italian food and sang Italian songs and maintained ties to villages they had left 30 or 40 years before. Marco met one family, the Rossettis, who had immigrated from a town just 20 miles from his own village. Mr. Rossetti had been a sharecropper in Italy, working land owned by wealthy signori and keeping barely enough of the harvest to feed his family. In America, he had started with nothing, had worked whatever jobs he could find, had saved every penny, and now owned a successful grocery store. His children spoke English as their first language, attended American schools, had opportunities that would have been unimaginable in Italy. At dinner in their home, Mr. Rossetti poured wine and spoke seriously to Marco across the table. "I left because there was no future there," he said, his Italian rusty but still fluent. "The old system. It keeps you in your place, you understand? Here, if you work hard, if you are smart and lucky, you can build something. You can own something. My children will go to university. My daughter wants to be a teacher." In Italy, could a grocer's daughter become a teacher? Marco had no answer because they both knew the truth. In Italy, class was destiny. The son of a farmer remained a farmer. The daughter of a grocer would marry another grocer. The system was rigid, traditional, suffocating in ways Marco had never quite articulated until this moment. The months passed, and Marco found himself settling into a rhythm that felt less like imprisonment and more like a strange kind of life. The work on Thompson's farm continued through the seasons. Cotton harvest gave way to winter wheat, then to spring planting. Thompson began to trust the Italian prisoners more, giving them tasks that required judgment and skill rather than just muscle. He taught Marco to drive the tractor, a machine that did the work of 10 men and seemed like magic compared to the oxen and hand tools Marco had used in Italy. The power of it, the efficiency, the way American agriculture operated on a scale that made Italian farming seem medieval by comparison. The small town near the camp began to feel familiar. The prisoners were allowed to walk into town on Sunday afternoons, always in groups, always supervised, but the restrictions felt pro forma rather than serious. They would browse the shops, buy small items with their wages, eat ice cream at the drugstore counter. The townspeople gradually grew accustomed to seeing Italian prisoners on their streets, and most treated them with cautious friendliness. Some shopkeepers learned a few Italian phrases. Some residents, especially the Italian-American families, went out of their way to make the prisoners feel welcome. It was not perfect, not utopian. There were people who glared at them, who muttered about enemies and traitors. There were rules and restrictions that reminded them they were not free. There were moments of homesickness so intense that Marco would lie awake all night thinking about the hills outside Naples, about his mother's face, about the girl he had promised to marry. But these moments of pain existed alongside moments of unexpected joy. A local baseball game where the prisoners were invited to watch and cheer. A harvest festival where they danced with American girls who giggled at their accents. A Christmas celebration where the whole camp sang carols in a mixture of Italian and English, and someone played an accordion, and for a few hours the war seemed very far away. The food remained a constant wonder. Every meal was abundant, varied, well prepared. The camp kitchen employed Italian prisoners who knew how to cook, and they managed to create dishes that tasted like home, even using American ingredients. Pasta with tomato sauce made from Texas tomatoes. Bread baked in the Italian style. On special occasions, there would be wine, and someone would propose a toast, and they would all drink together and pretend for a moment that they were not prisoners but simply Italians gathering as Italians had gathered for centuries. Marco began to learn English seriously, studying with a determination that surprised him. He borrowed books from the camp library, practiced with the guards, listened carefully when Americans spoke. Language was a key that could unlock this country, could help him understand how these people thought and what made their society work. The grammar was strange, the pronunciation difficult, but he persisted. He wanted to understand. He needed to understand how a nation this young, this chaotic, this seemingly disorganized could produce such abundance, such opportunity, such hospitality even toward enemies. News from home came irregularly and was often months out of date when it arrived. Marco learned that Naples had been bombed, that his village had been occupied first by Germans, then by Allied forces, that his family had survived, but conditions were terrible. Food was scarce. The black market ruled. Allied soldiers sometimes behaved badly. His fiancée's letters grew less frequent, then stopped entirely. He tried not to think about what that meant, tried to focus on the work and the strange life he was building in Texas. In April 1945, news came that Mussolini had been killed by partisans. His body hung upside down in Milan. The Italian prisoners received this news with mixed emotions. Some felt vindicated, their doubts about Il Duce confirmed. Others felt a kind of shame that their leader had ended so disgracefully. Marco felt mostly a numbness, a sense that an era had ended and whatever came next would be utterly different from what had come before. Italy would need to rebuild, to reimagine itself, to find a new way forward. What that would look like, he could not imagine. Then in May came the news that Germany had surrendered, that the war in Europe was over. The camp erupted in celebration, guards and prisoners alike rejoicing that the killing had stopped. But for the Italian prisoners, the celebration was complicated by uncertainty. The war was over. They would go home. But when? And to what? Italy was destroyed, occupied, politically unstable. The Mussolini regime had fallen. The king had abdicated. The country was split between North and South, between competing factions, between those who had resisted and those who had collaborated. Home was no longer the place they had left. It was something new and unknown and possibly dangerous. The American officers began processing prisoners for repatriation. The plan was to send them back in waves, starting in late 1945 and continuing into 1946. Forms were distributed, plans were made. Ships were scheduled. Marco filled out his paperwork mechanically, listing his village, his family members, his civilian occupation. But as he wrote, doubt gnawed at him. What was he going back to? A devastated country with no jobs, no food, no future. A fiancé who had stopped writing. A farm too small to support a family even in good times. Compared to what? Compared to this. To Texas, where he had learned skills and made friends and eaten well and been treated with basic human dignity. To America, where even prisoners of war had opportunities that Italian civilians lacked. To a country that was rich and strange and utterly foreign, but also, somehow, had started to feel like it might offer something that Italy could not. The thought was treason, was betrayal, was unthinkable, but Marco could not stop thinking it. Thompson made him an offer one afternoon in late summer. They were fixing a fence together, the work meditative and simple, when Thompson said without preamble, "War's over. You'll be going home soon, I expect." Marco nodded, not trusting his voice. Thompson hammered in another fence post, then continued. "I'm going to need help here. My boys are coming back from the war, but they've got their own plans. Don't want a farm. Can't say I blame them. But I need someone who knows the work, who I can trust." He paused, not looking at Marco. "I've written to some people in Washington. There might be a way, if you wanted, to stay. Work visa, maybe eventually citizenship. It's not guaranteed, mind you. Immigration laws are complicated. But if you were interested, I could try." The offer hung in the air between them like something physical. Marco's hands stilled on the wire he was stretching. Thompson kept working, giving him space to think. Stay. In America. Leave Italy forever. Leave his family. Leave everything he had known. And build a life in this strange place that had been so unexpectedly kind. It was impossible. It was unthinkable. It was exactly what he wanted, and the realization brought a shame so intense he could barely breathe through it. That night he lay awake and thought about his mother. She had lost her husband young, had raised 3 children alone, had sacrificed everything to keep them fed and clothed and respectable. How could he abandon her? How could he stay in America while she struggled in the ruins of Naples? But another voice whispered in his mind, what good would he do her in Italy? Another mouth to feed, another person struggling to survive in an economy that had collapsed. If he stayed in America, if he worked and saved, he could send money home. He could help her more from Texas than from a devastated Italian village. He thought about the girl he had promised to marry, whose letters had stopped coming. She had probably found someone else, someone who had not been captured, someone who was there rather than across an ocean. He could not blame her. 3 years was a long time to wait for a man who might never return. The life they had planned, the future they had imagined, it belonged to people who no longer existed. The war had changed them both, had changed everything. and perhaps the kindest thing he could do was let her go. Other prisoners were facing the same decision. The Americans had made clear that some pathways existed for Italian POWs to remain in the United States, especially those who had skills in agriculture or trades. The process was not simple, required sponsorship and paperwork and approval from multiple agencies. But it was possible. Some men seized the opportunity immediately, pragmatic about their chances in post-war Italy. Others were horrified by the idea, viewing it as betrayal of the worst kind. Marco stood somewhere in the middle, torn between love of home and the undeniable reality that America offered opportunities Italy could not match. He sought out Father O'Brien, needing to talk to someone who might understand. The priest listened without judgment as Marco poured out his confusion, his guilt, his shame at wanting to stay. When Marco finished, Father O'Brien was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "My grandparents left Ireland during the famine," he said finally. "Left behind parents, siblings, everyone they loved, crossed an ocean and never went back. It broke their hearts, but their children, my parents, had opportunities in America they never could have had in Ireland. Their grandchildren, me and my siblings, we went to university. We became teachers and nurses and priests. Was it wrong of my grandparents to leave? Were they traitors to Ireland?" Marco shook his head slowly. "No, Father, they did what they had to do." "And is Italy your grandparents' Ireland?" the priest asked gently. "Is it a place with no future, where staying means only hardship? Or is it home to which you owe your presence regardless of opportunity?" These were questions only Marco could answer, the priest said. But he should not let shame make the decision for him. Loyalty was important, but so was wisdom. So was choosing life over slow death. The decision crystallized over weeks of agonizing thought. Marco would stay, he would take Thompson's offer, would navigate the immigration process, would try to build a life in America, but he would send money home, would write letters, would maintain what connection he could with the family and the land that had formed him. It was not abandonment, he told himself. It was survival. It was choosing a future over a past that no longer existed. When he told Thompson, the farmer nodded and said he would start the paperwork. When he told his mother in a carefully written letter, her response was months in coming, but when it arrived, was more understanding than he had dared hope. "I want you to be happy," she wrote. "I want you to have a life, not just existence. If America can give you that, then stay with my blessing. But do not forget us. Do not forget where you come from." He wept when he read those words, wept with relief and grief and gratitude for a mother who loved him enough to let him go. The other prisoners who chose to stay formed a small community bound by their shared decision. They had all betrayed something to stay, had all chosen America over Italy, and this choice marked them in ways that those who returned home would never understand. But they had also chosen life, opportunity, the chance to build rather than merely survive. They supported each other through the complicated immigration process, helped each other navigate American culture, became brothers in a way that went beyond their shared service in the Italian army. Marco's transformation into an American was slow and never quite complete. He became a citizen eventually, married an Italian-American woman whose parents had emigrated long before, raised children who spoke English without accents and thought of themselves as Americans first. He prospered in modest but real ways, eventually buying his own small farm, sending money home to Naples until his mother's death, maintaining ties to Italy even as his life became thoroughly American. But part of him always remained that sunburned prisoner stepping off a train in Texas, tasting lemonade, and feeling his certainties begin to crack. It was not the wealth that had made him stay, though the opportunity mattered. It was not even the food, though the abundance had been shocking. It was the hospitality, the simple human kindness shown to an enemy, the way Americans had treated him like a person rather than a prisoner, like someone deserving of basic dignity. That hospitality had revealed a truth about America that propaganda could never capture, that this was a country built by people who had left somewhere else, who understood displacement and reinvention, who believed that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. Years later, when his children would ask why he had stayed, why he had chosen America over Italy, Marco would struggle to explain. How could he make them understand what it meant to be treated with kindness when you expected cruelty? How could he convey the psychological impact of abundance after scarcity, of opportunity after rigid class structures, of hope after the fascist years had drained hope from Italy? He would tell them about the lemonade, about Mrs. Thompson's smile, about the meals that had seemed impossible, about the small kindnesses that had added up to a completely different understanding of what life could be. The war had made him a prisoner, but American hospitality had set him free in ways that had nothing to do with fences or guards. It had freed him from the assumption that life was meant to be hard, that opportunity was for other people, that a farmer's son must always remain a farmer in the same village doing the same things his father had done. America had offered him a different story, a different possibility, and he had chosen it despite the cost, despite the guilt, despite everything that said he should go home. And he had never regretted it, not truly, though the complicated grief of that choice never entirely faded. He had built a good life, had raised good children, had contributed to his adopted country in ways large and small. He had also maintained his Italian heart, had passed down the language and the food and the stories to his children, had created a hybrid identity that was both Italian and American, and something new that was neither and both. This was the gift of American hospitality, he came to understand. Not just kindness to strangers, but the space to become someone new while honoring who you had been. And there were thousands more stories like this, waiting to be remembered.